The British Empire, like all empires, started and then ended. But in the middle, it was the largest and most populous empire to ever exist. And even back then, when people were dumb, they knew that this was the largest and most populous empire to ever exist. And a lot of them felt that opportunities only afforded to an empire of this size were being missed out on, because the empire was fractured. It had no shared unity or goal to push towards. And all of this culminated in 1997, where the empire officially ended. But what if that never happened? What if the empire never ended? That was the idea posed in 1883 in John Robert Seeley's book, The Expansion of England. In this book, he posed two possible futures for the British Empire. Option 1, the empire slowly drifts apart and Britain's colonies become independent and Britain is left a second-rate nation. Or option 2, the Dominions and Britain federate to create a Greater Britain and the world's first superstate. Now this might seem crazy, but it had worked before. Federation, that is. Australia had been federated, Canada had been federated, South Africa had been federated, so why couldn't they all federate once again? Distance! Australia is on the other side of the world, but with the invention of the telegraph, a message could be sent to Australia in a few hours. In fact, it was now easier to send a message from London to Sydney than it was to send a message from London to Edinburgh in 1707 when England and Scotland unified. So distance would be annoying, but not a deal breaker. What about culture? The Australians, Canadians, South Africans and New Zealanders are all separate peoples from the UK. Yes, definitely now, but not as much as you would think back then. A lot of people in the colonies saw themselves as just an extension of Britain. In fact, the only place where culture would have been an issue was Ireland, but Imperial Federation would have given her more autonomy whilst also keeping her in the empire. And that does sound contradictory. But let's talk about how Imperial Federation would have been run, and it will make a lot more sense. Ruling the Imperial Federation would have been an Imperial Parliament in London, replacing Westminster. The Imperial Parliament would be in charge of more empire-wide things, like trade policy, foreign policy, and the armed forces. Domestic issues would be left to local parliaments in the individual nations. The Parliament would have had members from all of the dominions who would vote and debate on policy, and it would also have representatives from other parts of the empire who wouldn't be allowed to vote on anything. Now this all sounds very well and good, but how would you go about achieving this? In 1884, just 1 year after the book was published, the Imperial Federation League was created, and it should be a bit of a red flag that this was an organisation created by private citizens and not the government ruling this empire. The goal of the Imperial Federation League was to spread the good word of Imperial Federation and bring the dominions closer together with each other and Britain. But how did the League plan to do this? First of all, they made their league above the petty politics of the mortal man. Anyone from any political party could join the league, if they could afford the small fee, of course, of 1 shilling. Some context, this was almost half a day's wages for a labourer back then, but to the aristocracy, this was nothing. The league would then use these fees to conduct their business around the empire. And it worked, with the league having branches in Canada and Australia. And it even managed to create the Colonial Conference, its biggest achievement that still survives to this day, as the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. But that was just the London branch. What did the other branches do? The Canadian branch didn't do much except react, because America invited Canada to join a customs union, which would have pulled her closer to America and pushed her further away from Britain. Obviously, this didn't happen, but they did tell the Canadian people that America and Canada were examples of how large territories could be managed, while also respecting the local authorities within that massive state, and that this could be done on an empire-wide scale as well. The Australian branch was the weirdest of the three, because they believed that the best way to achieve Imperial Federation was to have a concrete step-by-step plan to do it, and a plan on what Imperial Federation would actually do. And this might be part of the reason why the Australian branch of the League outlived the other branches. But why did the League eventually die? The League never really had a plan on how to unify the empire, and this was by design. Having a plan would lead to people being able to argue and disagree about the plan, instead of just talking about how nice it would be if Britain was always the strongest nation on earth. But towards the end of the century, tariffs in Britain were becoming a big issue, and eventually this issue made its way to the League. Because the League was above politics, and because tariffs were also above politics, people in the League began to argue about whether the Imperial Federation would have tariffs or not. And eventually this led to the end of the League. And if you want to know about the tariffs they were arguing about, and how, why, and when they will apply to the British Empire, because these tariffs, unlike Imperial Federation, actually happened, then watch my video on it. After this, of course. So what else was stopping Imperial Federation from happening? Let's start with the League, as they were the biggest supporters of Imperial Federation. I mean, they created the Colonial Conference, made the League non-political so anyone who liked the idea could join, which all seems pretty great until you realise that's all they did. Literally one thing. The politics thing was just lowering the bar to join, not actually achieving anything. The Australian branch was the only branch that thought a plan would be necessary. I mean, could you imagine something as complicated as 6 nations, maybe even more, on opposite sides of the planet all combining into one nation? And can you imagine trying to achieve this with every single step being done on the fly? Yeah, it's not going to be easy. In fact, it's probably not going to be possible. And you can see when the tariff or no tariff conversation came up, it fractured and destroyed the League. And this was one issue, and in the grand scheme of things, not even a huge one. Nothing like when will the Imperial Parliament's authority stop and local Parliament's authority begin? Would nations be allowed to leave the Federation? Would new nations ever be allowed to join the Federation? Economic policy? How would inequality between the members be handled? Would the Imperial Parliament be able to overrule local parliaments? speaking of the Imperial Parliament, the ruling body of this entire nation, all they had figured out was the Dominions would have members and other parts of the Empire would have representatives that couldn't vote at the Parliament. And that was it. How many members would the Imperial Parliament have? Who knows? How much power would the Imperial Parliament have? At least a bit. How would the members of this new parliament be decided? Your guess is as good as mine. How many members would each nation have? Probably less than Britain. And you can see why not having a plan on how a nation would be run is a bit of a problem when you were trying to create a new nation out of 6 nations that are already functioning perfectly well. Let's take a step back and talk about the common man for a second. You would think that every single Briton would want Imperial Federation to happen, because they would never want the Empire to end. But the Empire was never that big of a deal to the average person. To the ruling elite, it was everything, but to the average person, they didn't really care. The Empire was cool and all, but not really an everyday thought. So they didn't care about Imperial Federation, so the government also didn't care about Imperial Federation, which is a huge deal. There was also the people who opposed an Imperial Federation because they thought that the idea of an Imperial Parliament would be worse than just having local governments, as a shared government would lead to lots of conflict and at best compromises on what the nations actually wanted. There was also the matter of the Dominions and their identity. Before World War I, they believed themselves to be British, but one of the only good things to come out of World War I was the national identities of Canada, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand. They would now no longer accept the Imperial Federation as they now saw themselves as separate from Britain. And that's how the idea of Imperial Federation ended. There was never a plan, and when there was the slightest inkling of a plan, it caused the entire organisation to collapse. It had very little support in Britain, and then after the horrors of World War I, it lost all support in the Dominions. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you like history, because if you made it this far and you don't, you must have fallen asleep or your boyfriend is making you watch this. But if none of those things apply to you and you do like history, you should subscribe to see more history. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!